Let us begin then with the simpler of the two kinds of policies, that being the connection request policy that we've already configured. I mean, when we went through that wizard earlier on to configure that VPN connection from here over to our remote access server, that wizard actually created both a connection request policy as well as the network policy that we're using here. So you'll notice here under connection request policies, we have the default one that was available before we ever went through any wizard configuration for using Windows authentication for all users. This is the one that would be processed first, as you can see here with a processing order equal to 1. As you can see here with the default one, this default connection request policy provides a way to determine when users would be able to connect in, so some day and time restrictions on that authentication. And then down here, what the authentication provider would be. So in our case, the local computer, this NPS server itself. We also have this VPN connections policy that we created as well. This is the one that defines those incoming connections from our remote access server. So let's take a look here. As you'll see that there's just not that much in terms of what we need to configure, mostly because we're dealing with a non-proxy type environment. We're just simply authenticating things here on this local NPS server. So over here under conditions is where you can see the incoming NAS port type is set to VPN. Effectively, we are using this for a VPN connection. But down here under add is where we can configure some of the other conditions that would define whether or not this policy is going to apply to the connections coming in. So what is the username used by the access client? That's information that would be provided from the remote access server. The access client itself, so that machine out in the coffee shop or in the airport of the world, what's its IPv4 or IPv6 address? Which types of protocols are that client attempting to come in on? PPP versus SLIP, for example. Slightly more important are down here the service type. So what kind of tunnel is that person using to connect in? Are they attempting to connect in through some hardwired 802.1x configuration or some of the others down here? Even more important is the tunnel type, where we can define the specific kind of tunnel that has to be used for us to be able to then authenticate and allow the user to work with our internal resources. Back in that earlier course, we talked about the variety of different kinds of VPN tunnel types that can be created, and how by default, the client will attempt to negotiate whatever tunnel at whatever strength it possibly can. Starting down here with some of the other ones like PPTP and L2TP, and up towards some of the other ones like SSTP and then ESP. So if you have the need to determine a specific tunnel type and the associated security for that tunnel, you can define that here, and your NPS server will just simply not allow any traffic to come in if that client hasn't negotiated, the end state client hasn't negotiated a tunnel of sufficient quality. I can here also determine some date and time restrictions, so when would that user potentially be able to connect in? These aren't configured here, they're all set to denied because we haven't configured that here for the policy. But I could punch in, Monday through Friday, for example, from 8 to 5, and then disallow users from connecting up over any other associated period of time. What is the identity type? This is something we'll discuss a little further in the next module when we start talking about network access protection. Down here also are some Radius client properties. Now these aren't the client sitting in the coffee shop. This is the Radius client itself, or our remote access server. So what is the friendly name, the IP address, the calling station ID? This is used when we have telephones that we're calling in on. What are those characteristics associated with that remote access server? Also, if we're using a gateway, we can use gateway information down here. So this is just other configurations associated with that gateway. And in this case, we're mostly dealing with things like the remote desktop gateway. So these conditions, again, are ways for this server to determine who should actually authorize the connection request. Now, where that actually gets decided actually happens over here under the Settings tab, where you can identify who and how you want that connection request to be authenticated. Now you see here that we've got the ability to override the network policy authentication settings. We'll actually take care of those over in the network policy itself. The big item is right here under authentication, right here, where you determine where you want those requests to be authenticated. So is it on this machine? Is it on some other machine in the case of a Radius proxy, or do you just simply accept the users without validating their credentials? Down here is accounting. So when you authenticate those users, how do you want to handle the accounting of those users as well? And then further are some translations that you can apply if you've set up realm names. Recall back in that previous module where we talked about how realm names are a way to either obfuscate or virtualize some of the inbound information that users are using to connect into resources. This allows you to apply rules that determine when something is found in inbound information, like the called station ID or the username. Go ahead and replace that with some other value, perhaps a domain name, for example. And then down here under radius attributes, whenever the response actually gets sent back to your radius client, do you want to provide some additional attributes that radius client may require? These attributes can be defined by whatever that radius client may require. Now, in our case, we've got a remote access server that doesn't require any of these additional attributes, but if you have some other solution, even a vendor-specific third-party solution, you can create these and provide that information so that remote access server has whatever it needs in order to receive those clients and pass on their information inside.